I'm a 30-year-old female. I recently received a promising job offer that would almost pay double what I make in my current job, so I promptly set up the interview with the boss. The job is out of state, meaning I'd obviously have to travel, then move if I got it, but I was willing to, since I live alone in a small apartment. I found an Airbnb that was close to the city and booked it for 2 nights, since it was a 2-day interview. My first part of the interview was scheduled for 9:30 in the morning, so I planned on getting there the night before. As I was driving along the highway, my car got a flat tire. I don't have a spare in my car, so I had to wait for AAA. They didn't come until 2 hours after I called, where I learned that they don't give people spare tires, so they had to tow it. Luckily, I was able to get into a nearby car shop where they replaced it and sent me on my way. The unfortunate event delayed my trip by almost 4 hours, so I didn't even get to the Airbnb until 1 a.m. I was bummed out that I'd be getting in so late, but stayed positive since I'd be able to make it to the interview in the morning. As I pulled up to the Airbnb, I noticed that the houses didn't have driveways, so all of the cars were parked in the street. Just to note, I didn't do much research on the house before booking it since I'd only be there for a couple days. The only things I looked for were a nice bedroom and kitchen. I found a parking spot just a couple houses down from my Airbnb, and I pulled up the email with the lockbox code to get the key. I punched the code in and it opened, and there was nothing. Great, I thought to myself, one problem right after the other. I assumed that the owner must have forgotten to put the key in the lockbox for me. I tried the front door handle, but it was locked, so I called the number listed for the owner several times, but there was no answer. I left a voice message, hopelessly explaining my situation to him, even though I knew I wouldn't hear back from him until the next day. I was pretty much screwed. As a last resort, I tried knocking on the door, hoping that by some miracle it would magically open. I walked back to my car and started searching for nearby hotels, since I didn't even have a place to stay for the night, and it was almost 2 a.m. Of course, every hotel in a reasonable distance was booked for the night because of some medical convention that they were having in the city. I could tell that I was not in a very safe area, so I really didn't want to sleep in my car. But after exhausting all my options, I had no choice. Just as I was about to recline the seat and close my eyes, a light inside the house I was supposed to be staying in flipped on. It concerned me, but my curiosity got the best of me, so I walked up to the house and knocked on the door. There was no answer for a minute, until I finally heard the deadbolt unlatch, and the door swung open. I was greeted by a man, maybe in his mid-30s, who was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. I said, "Hi, do you live here?" And he looked at me with a confused look until he replied, No, I'm renting it out for the week." I explained to him how I rented it out on Airbnb, but he told me that was weird because he rented it out on Zillow. So apparently, the owner must have made a mistake and accidentally listed the Airbnb as available, even though it was currently being rented. He introduced himself as Zach and asked if I wanted to come inside while we sorted everything out. I stepped in because I needed to warm up and use the restroom. The stress of the day started getting to me as I started sobbing in the bathroom, realizing I'd have to sleep in my car in a bad neighborhood or sleep in a house with some random guy. Either way, I was not looking forward to the night. I got myself together and came back out to see that he made us each a cup of tea. I'm an avid tea drinker and usually have a cup before bed every night, but I said no thanks since I literally just met him and didn't trust him yet. We sat down at the table while I continued trying to find a place for the night. After 20 minutes of trying with no luck, he offered letting me stay with him for the night, mentioning that the neighborhood wasn't safe, which confirmed my assumption from earlier. He even offered to let me sleep in the bedroom while he'd sleep on the couch. Despite my better judgment, I accepted his offer, thanked him, said goodnight, then went to the bedroom. As I got in my room, I set my suitcase down on the dresser and quickly spotted his wallet. I'm usually not a nosy person, but I went through it just because of the situation. As soon as I opened it up, I found his ID. When I squinted my eyes to look at the picture, I saw his face. The strange thing is that the ID belonged to a man named Benjamin, and the name Zachary was definitely not on the card. I didn't want to psych myself out, so I calmly walked out of my room and set the wallet down in the kitchen and said, "You left your wallet in the room." Right as I said that, for the first time that night, I sensed a nervousness in his response. "Oh, okay, thanks, good night." He was holding a bottle of wine in his hand and it looked like I definitely caught him off guard. I nodded my head and walked back into the room, where I quickly realized that there was no lock on the door. I checked the bathroom and found the same thing. Great. At that point, I was beyond exhausted from the stress of the long day and quickly passed out. During the night, I was awakened to the sound of my door creaking open. I picked my head up and almost lost it when I saw a shadowy figure walk past the door and down the hallway towards the living room and kitchen area. I felt like I was going to throw up. Realizing that I was all alone and defenseless, with a complete stranger who was spying on me at night while I slept, I quietly sat up and grabbed my suitcase as I planned on sneaking out of the house. In order to get to the front door, you'd have to pass through the living room where he'd be, so I had to find another way out. I didn't even explore the house up until this point, since I had much bigger problems. I slowly opened the bedroom door, and as quietly as I could, I turned right into the hallway, where I began checking the other doors for an exit. There were 3 other doors, and the first 2 were storage rooms, so I assumed the other one would be too. However, the third and final door was much different. It was a guest bedroom. Right at that moment, I felt my blood turn cold as I stared at a broken window facing the backyard. It wasn't the exit I was hoping to find, but I took no time to hesitate and jumped out of it, all while making a ton of noise. I didn't care at this point though. As I landed the small drop down onto the grass, I realized that I most likely just spent the night with a squatter who broke into my Airbnb. I made my way around the side of the house, dragging my suitcase along as my heart was beating out of my chest. I popped the trunk, threw the suitcase in, and slammed it shut. Right as I did, I noticed a light flick on and watched as the front door swung open, and Zach, or whoever it was, stared at me through the screen door. I got out of there faster than a bolt of lightning. I went straight to the police and told them a random man was staying in my Airbnb and was stalking me as I slept. I explained how he introduced himself as Zach, but his ID didn't match the name since it said Benjamin on it. They sent officers over to the house and found it completely vacant. By the time I left the police station, it was already after 5 a.m., and there was no way I'd be able to go to the interview. I drove straight home with no sleep and decided to sort everything out the next day. When I was almost home, I got a call from the Airbnb host, who apologized to me, saying that he completely forgot to put the key in the lockbox. I ignored his apology and asked him if the house was listed on Zillow as well. There was a couple-second pause until he replied no and asked why, seeming very confused. That response confirmed it for me. I spent the night in a house with a complete stranger who broke in and pretended to be renting it out, then stalked me. I don't even want to know what his plans were if I had not woken up and didn't escape. Looking back now, it was foolish of me to trust him, but at the time, in my desperation, it seemed like my only choice. Last winter, my family and I drove up to New York for the holidays. I'm a father of 2 kids. I have a 7-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter. My wife's side of the family lives just about an hour outside of New York City. It's been our tradition for the past 5 years to drive up there for Christmas and visit, since I didn't have much family of my own. This year, we decided to look into Airbnb, since we would have more space to accommodate us for the week. We booked a beautiful 2-story house, just 10 minutes away from their residence. We arrived on Christmas Eve, then drove over to my wife's parents' house to celebrate. Once it started getting late, we drove back to the Airbnb to get some sleep, since we were planning on spending Christmas Day at their house again. However, when we woke up the next morning, we quickly realized that we got much more snow than they originally forecasted. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of white, and the snow was continuing to fall. The radar didn't look promising, and the updated forecast called for multiple inches of snow over the next few hours. We were pretty much snowed in, so we were left with no choice but to spend Christmas Day at the Airbnb. We still celebrated Christmas as a family and planned out some fun things to do for the day. Unfortunately, the weather continued to worsen as the week went on, preventing us from going anywhere. Despite the circumstances, we were making the best of our trip, playing in the snow and sledding down makeshift hills we built in the backyard. To a southern family who never experiences snow, we were enjoying it a lot more than the average person. However, on the evening of our 4th night there, our blissful week turned into an absolute nightmare. Around 5:30 p.m., my wife and I were in the kitchen cooking dinner, while my son and daughter were sledding and building snowmen in the backyard. From our vantage point, looking into the backyard from the kitchen window, we were able to monitor them the entire time, except for when they'd go down the little hill in the opposite direction of the house. I was washing my hands in the sink, where I could see my daughter, wearing her pink jacket, dragging her sled along the snow towards the hill. I watched as her head dropped below the horizon, as she let out cheerful screams and descended down the hill. I smiled with content, seeing that she was having the time of her life. Just as I dried my hands off, the timer to the microwave started beeping, so I walked over to it. My son came bursting through the back door, screaming. We assumed he got hurt, so we walked over to him and tried to see what happened. He wasn't saying anything, or at least anything we could make out, but he kept pointing towards the backyard as he continued to scream and cry. I instantly realized my daughter probably got hurt, so I slipped on my boots and clumsily sprinted through the snow-covered backyard to the hill. As soon as I was able to see what was at the bottom, I felt like my heart stopped. My daughter wasn't there, it was just her sled. I ran down to the bottom of the hill, where I was able to make out a set of footsteps that were clearly human and much bigger than a child's. The sun had pretty much set, and I needed to follow them, but I couldn't see. Part of me wanted to run into the woods and scream her name and find her, but a more logical and rational part of me took over. I ran back to the house and grabbed the flashlight we brought, along with a kitchen knife. Then I told my wife to call the police. Time was of the essence, and I knew every second that passed was another footstep further away from my daughter. I took no time to hesitate, and quickly followed the footsteps into the woods. Due to the time of year, most of the trees were bare, which provided a better line of vision into the woods. The moonlight illuminated the snow, providing just enough light to see a short distance ahead of me. Every part of me wanted to call out her name, but I knew if I did that, then the person would hear me as well, and most likely speed up. I had no idea if they were armed, but it didn't matter to me. I was willing to do whatever it took to save my daughter. I continued following the footsteps, keeping the fastest pace I could while keeping track. At the time, I had no idea how much time passed, but it had to be at least 15 minutes looking back. Eventually, I spotted a desolate road up ahead and quickly ran up to it, instantly realizing the footsteps were gone. My heart sank as I realized they could have gone anywhere. I made my way to the opposite side of the road, scanning for anything close to the resemblance of a human footstep. I assumed the person knew they'd be tracked, so they most likely were walking alongside the road. The problem was that I had no way of knowing which way they went. That was when I realized I was truly living in a nightmare. I had a 50-50 chance, and I had to decide in that moment to go left or right. I knew the police were probably already searching as well, but I had to make a decision at that moment. To this day, I don't know why, but something inside of me told me to turn left, and I did. I ran as fast as I ever have. The person could easily turn into the woods at any point off of the road, and I'd have no way of knowing. I took my chances and followed the shoulder of the road, forcing myself to not scream her name in fear of them hearing me. Just as I started thinking that they went the other way, I spotted the silhouette of a person walking alongside the road ahead. As I got closer, I was able to see my daughter in his arms, and then I got the biggest adrenaline rush of my life. I knew at any moment if that person had a gun, they would turn around and shoot me, but I had to try. I screamed at them to stop, and I saw the face of an old man turn around and look at me. He started running with her, but I was faster. As I screamed profanities at him, I charged at him with my knife in hand. As soon as he saw the knife, he dropped my daughter into the snow and began running away. I can't even describe to you how badly I wanted to chase him and get my justice, but now that I had my daughter, I wasn't going to leave her side. I embraced her in the tightest hug I'd ever given and kissed her on the forehead as we both cried uncontrollably. I had my daughter, and that was all that mattered. At that moment, the relief I felt was indescribable. I held her hand as we walked the opposite way up the road, back towards our Airbnb, until we eventually saw a police car driving down the road. The officer flipped his lights on and pulled right up in front of us. He drew his gun on me and ordered me to get on the ground. I tried explaining to him that I was her father and the guy was just up the road, but I understood he was just doing his job since they were looking for an abducted girl with a man. Shortly after, he confirmed that I was the father and gave us a ride to the police station. Unfortunately, this allowed the man to get away since they stopped me. I had to fill out a ton of paperwork until they finally sent us home for the night. To this day, we still don't know who the disgusting person was that tried kidnapping my daughter. I don't consider myself to be a hero in any way. I just did what any father would have done in that situation. The most important thing is that I have my family. I'm an Airbnb host. I listed my property on Airbnb 3 years ago. It's an old cabin that my grandpa used to live in before he passed, that's very secluded in the woods. After losing his wife over a decade ago, he moved out to the cabin in the woods. where he was surrounded by his favorite thing, nature. Now, I only live about a half hour away from the cabin. I always go there and clean it in between guests staying. Even though it's off of the beaten path, we usually have quite a lot of guests, especially in the summer. However, this past winter marked the first time I've ever had a problem hosting the Airbnb. I got a request from a girl named Bailey to stay at the cabin for the weekend. She was a college student who was taking the weekend to study for exams that she needed to pass. We went back and forth, and my initial impression was that she seemed polite and kind. My wife and I like to offer discounts for college students, so we let her stay for 20% off. Everything started out just like normal. My wife met her at the cabin, gave her the key, and drove back home to tell me that Bailey was content with the cabin. We had a 5-star rating that we wanted to keep, so we'd always accommodate the guests as best as possible. It was good for business. My wife and I went to bed pretty early that night, when we were awakened to my wife's phone ringing. Whenever we have a guest, my wife puts their phone number in as a favorite in her contacts, so they'll be able to get a hold of us at any time, even if we're sleeping with the Do Not Disturb setting turned on. Calls this late were unusual, so both of us sat up in bed and put her on speaker. "Hey, are you at the Airbnb right now?" My wife and I looked at each other with immediate concern. "No, we're not. Why? What's going on?" "I keep hearing footsteps upstairs." I immediately grabbed the phone from my wife and told her no. "We're calling the police now. We're gonna drive up there too. Can you lock yourself in a room?" I handed the phone over to my wife while I called the police. My wife and I quickly got in our car. We'd never had any sort of problem with the cabin, not even a faucet leak. This whole situation had my wife and I hysterical. Who else would be in the cabin? We pulled up to our Airbnb, where there were several cop cars out front. We introduced ourselves to the police as the owners, and explained how we got a call from our guest, mentioning they heard footsteps inside. The officer looked at us with an upsetting expression and said, "Officers are still searching the cabin, but so far they haven't found anyone." Hearing that sent shivers down our spines, as we realized that our guest was potentially kidnapped. After further searching, there was still no sign of Bailey. They led us into the house to unlock some of the doors that we keep off limits to guests, in case she somehow managed to get inside. There was nothing. As we walked through the kitchen towards the front door to leave, I saw her laptop, along with several binders and a textbook, all flipped open, where she must have been studying at the time she called us. The immense discomfort of this situation made us sick. We eventually finished talking with the police and walked back outside, where canine units were preparing to search for her. We still haven't heard from her, nor have the police given us any promising updates. We just hope that she's okay.